Let's have a closer look at the crazy times of the ITC Championship, which in 1996 was won by a highly complex and legendary touring car, the Black Cliff Opel Calibra V6 DTM. To understand how the underdog Opel could win this highly complex racing series, which was by the way more advanced and more expensive at the time than Formula 1, we have to go back to the 1980s DTM Championship. DTM stands for Deutsche Tourenwagen Meisterschaft, so German Touring Cars Championship. The series was a national championship and hence mostly competing in Germany. Until 1989, Opel was competing with the Kadett GSI. This was a car with transversal drivetrain and front-wheel drive. Competitors were the Mercedes 190, the BMW E30 M3, and the Ford Sierra Cosworth. So the competitors had longitudinal engines and rear-wheel drive. So Opel changed to the Opel Omega 3000 for the 1990 season. Now they also had a car with longitudinal engine and rear-wheel drive. But their Omega was bigger and heavier than the competition. Audi joined in 1990 with the large Audi V8, but they had all-wheel drive. Also, Opel had an inline 6-cylinder engine which was good for up to 4 liters. But the regulations limited engines to 3 liters, and for only 3 liters the engine was too heavy. The competition drove with 4-cylinder engines. So the Opel Omega was a better basis, but still not the perfect car. Smaller Opel cars had transversal drivetrains, so also that wasn't a good basis. At that time, two things happened. First thing was that Opel presented the Opel Calibra in 1989. This was a sport coupe based on the Vectra. It was super aerodynamic and had 4 seats, an important requirement for DTM cars. But also the Calibra had a transversal drivetrain and front-wheel drive. The next thing that happened was that the regulators started to work on a new, much more open set of rules for the 1993 season. These new Class 1 regulations allowed for significant modifications of the road cars. So that was the entry ticket for the Calibra. So, first of all, the Opel Calibra had to be approved by the regulators. They sent the German TÜV to Opel to measure the headroom of the rear passengers, a requirement of the rules, so manufacturers would use a standard sedan and not a much more aerodynamic coupe body shape. Of course, Opel prepared the seat cushion for this test and the Calibra was approved, but it was tight. The next thing was that Opel was now allowed to mount the engine longitudinally in the car. The regulations now only allowed 2.5 liter capacity. In order to achieve higher engine speed, you want less stroke and more bore, but a 4-cylinder needs longer stroke to reach the 2.5 liters, and bore was already at the limit. So higher RPMs are possible with more cylinders. So Opel wanted to have a V6 engine, so more cylinders than the competition and a compact engine. They chose their new 54-degree V6. 54 degrees so it can fit everywhere. Distance between cylinders was 93 mm and Opel increased bore to 90 mm. So the wall thickness between cylinders was only 3 mm. That was only possible with a special cast iron block. Another unique thing about the Calibra was that Opel decided to use all-wheel drive after they saw what Audi was able to do with their quattros. Opel pushed the engine and gearbox as far back as possible and the result was that the engine was sitting on the front axle. To drive the front axle, the front drive shaft had to run through the oil sump. In order to reduce the weight of the crankshaft, they drilled out the rod-bearing draw nails. And that created a painful issue with this first generation. Because of the constant shaking, oil mixed with air and engines ended up with lubrication issues. Opel filled the void again and the problems were gone. So this was just the first version of the Calibra DTM car to get the project approved internally, so they could keep going. After these first experiences, Opel developed the Calibra further and was looking for a better base engine. The regulations said that it doesn't have to be an engine that is sold in this car. It can be any engine of this manufacturer. And since Opel was part of GM, they found a more suitable engine at Isuzu, also sold as Opel Monterey. It was an aluminium 75-degree V6. The bigger angle made the engine lower, lowered the center of gravity, and they used red liners for the cylinders. For the cylinder head, they worked together with Cosworth. With their F1 experiences, they designed a cylinder head with pneumatic valve springs. So there are no coil springs anymore, which can break under high RPM. They could tune this naturally aspirated engine to 520 horsepower and 13,000 RPM. Not long before that, F1 cars had 500 horsepower from 3-liter engines. And these 520 horsepower were even with 2 catalytic converters in the back. Very nice to see is also the open injection system, just like in F1. Back in the day, they were driving 2 races at one weekend with a 20-minute break between them. After Opel's previous experience, they wanted to be able to swap the engine within this time. But because of their all-wheel drive system, an engine swap took much longer than for their rear-wheel drive competitors. So Opel developed a unique drivetrain concept, where the front wheels were driven by gear pairings each side of the engine. So there was no shaft going through the engine anymore. That way, they could have all-wheel drive, but an engine swap was as fast as on a rear-wheel drive car. So mechanics could prepare the whole front end, including cooling and engine, and just swap the whole assembly. The regulations were pretty open, and that increased development costs of these cars. For some manufacturers, the money was too much for a national championship, and so they founded the ITC, International Touring Car Championship, in 1995. Being an international championship with races in Brazil and Japan should justify the budgets, but the series stayed the same. In the meantime, the Calibra became the favorite car of the fans. The low coupe-like shape in comparison to the boxy sedan shape of the competition, the high revving, screaming V6 engine and all-wheel drive were fascinating. And the development went on. Opel pushed the gearbox to the passenger side so the driver could sit more in the center of the car for better weight distribution. They had a customized ABS system from Bosch, which wasn't an easy task because there wasn't much experience with all-wheel drive cars on slicks and ABS at that time. The gearbox was fully automatic. You only needed the clutch from a complete stop. Upshifts and downshifts happened completely automatic without any driver input. The clutch wasn't even disengaged for shifting. It always stayed engaged, and shaft speeds were matched by cutting ignition and fuel for upshifts and automatic throttle for downshifts. The electronics were developed together with Williams F1, and remember what knowledge they had in F1 in 1993. And another impressive feature of the Calibra was its GPS system. The car always knew where it is on the track and which corner comes next. That was important input for the following systems. The Calibra had adjustable anti-roll bars at front and rear. It had adjustable differentials, adjustable brake balance, and an adjustable rear wing. It had a movable ballast weight that drove through the car to change weight distribution for each corner. The car could close its air intakes on the straights for an impressive race car drag coefficient of 0.4. So all these systems depended on the location signal of the GPS system. A problem was if the car was spinning out. The GPS needed to reset its location. The Calibra had 3 fuel tanks in the back and the dry sump oil reservoir. Fuel could be pumped between the tanks for better balance. So the weight balance with the tanks in the back was a bit rear biased, which gave the car good mechanical traction, which in return allowed them to use a smaller rear wing, which reduced drag. With all these advanced and complicated functions, the Calibra was first too complex and needed to be simplified. The famous Team Joest ran the cars for Opel, so that was the works team. Joest later on ran Audi's works team in Le Mans. Zackspeed, which later drove the dominating Viper at the Nordschleife, check out my other video for more, and Rosberg were 2 private teams to run the Calibra. The later versions of the Calibra had pushrod suspension at front and rear, and also the aerodynamics development was impressive. They used angled radiators at the front and outlets in front of the front wheels, where they have lower pressure for a good exit. So Opel was not only the most popular car, they could also win the ITC Championship in 1996 with Manuel Reuter in its iconic Black Cliff Calibra. Reuter was the young, dominating driver among the Opel team. The 1997 version was another big step. The Calibra was even more extreme, and they now moved cooling outlets into the wheel arch, so they could use the sides for more downforce. Also, they tested steel-by-wire on these cars already. But because of all the crazy developments under this open rulebook with no limits on test and technology, costs increased too high, and because the ITC was an international championship, the German home crowd lost interest. In 1996, Mercedes spent 100 million, Opel 140 million, and Alfa 170 million mark. At the same time, because of all that open development, teams shielded their cars and fans couldn't get close or see anything. Opel and Alfa pulled the plug at the end of the 1996 season, and you can see Opel's 1997 car at Zakspeed today. Opel and Mercedes then worked on new Class 1 regulations with standardized parts and better cost control, which then resulted in the new DTM, now Deutsche Tourenwagen Masters, from the year 2000. The Calibra had another impressive appearance in 1999. Volker Striezek, race driver and Calibra project leader, drove the car at the 24-hour race at the Nürburgring to celebrate Opel's 100th anniversary. He drove the Calibra for the planned 4 hours and 40 minutes and then pulled into the Opel party tent. During this time, he was 5 seconds per lap quicker than the dominating Viper, run by the previous Calibra team, Zakspeed. So the Calibra was well ahead of its time, super complex, and was still reliable and quick to win the championship. It's a legend until today and a piece of history. In fact, if we compare cars on the Norris ring, the 1996 Calibra is only 1 second slower than the 4-liter V8 Class 1 DTM cars of 2012 and only 3 seconds per lap slower than the 600 horsepower turbo DTM cars of 2020. So let me know how you like the ITC Calibra and the crazy ITC Championship in the comments below, and see you at the next video.